Welcome to the fifth Arcanum, our study of the Hierophant, or the Pope, in the Hermetic Mystery School. Today we're looking at Tomberg's fifth letter in Meditations on the Tarot. We have a lovely quote to start off our investigation, where he says, the Kabbalah compares the role of prayer and benediction to a double movement, ascending and descending, similar to the circulation of the blood. The prayers of humanity rise towards God, and after having been oxidized, are transformed into benedictions, which descend below from above. The Hierophant, Arcanum, or Pope, as we find it in the Marseille deck, used by Tomberg, as well as other decks, of course. The earlier tarot decks often had Pope, and even the Popess, instead of the High Priestess. We can detect from this that there is a special relationship between the Empress and the Emperor, and the High Priestess, or Popess, in very old decks, and the Hierophant, or Pope. The Pope or Hierophant, and we will use these terms interchangeably in the context of Tomberg's fifth Arcanum, is begun with the simple exegesis, as Tomberg always addresses his audience: dear unknown friend. The card, the Pope, puts us in the presence of the act of benediction. It is essential to have this in mind when we undertake the interpretation, not only of the structure of the whole card, but also of each of its particular elements. One should therefore never lose sight from that in the first place. It is the matter of benediction and everything associated with it. No matter who the Pope may be, or who the acolytes kneeling before him are, and no matter what the two columns behind the Pope signify, and no matter what his tiara and the triple cross he is holding symbolize. What is benediction? What is its source and its effect? Who has the authority to bestow benediction? What role does it play in the spiritual life of humanity? These are the questions that Tomberg takes very seriously in this chapter, and reveals perhaps the core philosophy that he presents in his interpretation of sacred magic, which, though similar to historical definitions of magic such as theurgy, is really not the same thing, as we learn so clearly from our careful analysis of the Empress card. I want to address, given how highly I recommend Chris and Pat Zaleski's Magical Tarot of the Golden Dawn, I want to begin with saying something about that this Arcanum in that text that I think is misleading in relationship to the card. And that's because we use the Zaleski material and respect it quite highly, of course, in our work, and in the Golden Dawn tradition. But occasionally there's a little thing that we can see that will give us a better understanding of the card itself and what it means to go from the Pope to the Hierophant, because I think that's something that a lot of people are most likely to get hung up on, especially given how the tarot have become primarily a non-Catholic endeavor. And I think everyone would agree that it's mostly even a pagan practice these days. Most Christians would avoid the tarot compared to the quantity of other people using it. Now, so the Zaleskis in there, and this is a fabulous book that they have, like, again, I'm a big fan of their approach to the Golden Dawn system, even though they acknowledge it is an approach, and their approach, not to be considered a universal kind of dogmatism by any means. They say one of the old titles for this card is the Pope, which related to the dogma of Catholicism. But with this change in name, the emphasis of what he stands for shifts to a more esoteric consideration and not to the doctrine of ex cathedra. Okay. So first of all, we should keep in mind that without any doubt, it was the totalitarian mission of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to supersede all of his fellow bishops, and this led to a great schism, the great schism, between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches in 1055, I think, not 1015. I misspoke. However, it was not until the First Vatican Council from 1869 to 1870 that Pastor Aeternus, the document from that council, was written and established papal infallibility, which has only been used once since then, in 1950, concerning the Assumption of Mary, and that she went bodily into heaven. So it's been used twice. And it's always issued from the throne of St. Peter, hence ex cathedra, from the throne, or the cathedra, which is where the throne is, the sedes. So when we consider Tomberg's preference for the Pope, and here's the point, over the Hierophant, we must keep in mind that as much as Tomberg argues for a faithful understanding of papal infallibility, he even often explores what that would mean on a mystical level. If that's your cup of tea, you can explore his thoughts on that. But his main interest is in conveying the mystical nature of the spiritual teacher or adept, rather than promoting Catholic dogma. We know this as well from his biography, of course, and from his personal writings. Tomberg, who continued to worship and take communion in Eastern Orthodox churches and was welcomed to do that, believed he could reconcile both his Roman Catholicism and his Eastern Orthodoxy within himself, almost like a Hierophant, one might say. Now, I like to think of this as mystical heresy at its finest. I would argue that Tomberg sees the mystical core of the Pope and invites us to understand what that truly is, as Hierophant, the perfection of man, the keeper of the mysteries. And since the Pope existed in the tarot for hundreds of years before the doctrine of ex cathedra or papal infallibility came about, it does make less sense, I would argue, that the Arcanum was interpreted cynically as dogmatism. So I think this is the error, this is a salient error in modern interpretations that I think the Zaleskis fell into here by referencing ex cathedra, right? If they're referencing ex cathedra as a critique against the Pope card in the tarot, which has been around for so long, it doesn't really make sense because that thing didn't exist when the Pope was being put in the tarot and interpreted in the tarot. And most people back then, these are ancient times. They didn't have the internet or even photographs. Most people would live and die with the Pope as their spiritual guru, for sure. And they did see him that way, but they would never have even seen a picture of him. They might not really even understand where he lived. We have to think of medieval and Renaissance peasants here, and even before that, right? For Tomberg, the Pope represents genuine spiritual teaching, and the argument I'm making is that that is how it would be seen in the context of the tarot cards in general, because this idea of the totalitarian Pope that we have today in post Renaissance history, and there was a period in which there was two popes fighting it out in Italy, and then there was a third one in Avignon, and it was chaos. And this was all around that early Renaissance time period as well. So there was 3 popes for a while. So given the tarot predates the Protestant Reformation, even those who own tarot decks would have considered the Pope as the spiritual leader of the entire world. This is their view of the Pope as they're looking at their tarot decks. They don't look at it and say, oh, that guy who's infallible, right? Even today, it's a weak criticism, because the Pope's never really used it, except for the fact that Mary got zoomed up into heaven bodily. I hope no Catholics ever see this lecture and feel I'm being flip about that, but that is the facts. So to view the Pope in the major arcana as a symbol of Catholic dogmatism is anachronistic at best, and at worst polemical. I think it is not unfair to say that the Zaleskis intended the latter. I think they were just being a little bit polemical, because it's very common for people to take pot shots at the Roman Catholic Church. I myself do it from time to time, rather than think they were merely being sloppy, right? But of course, this is my speculation. And please note also, I would not consider the polemical interpretation to be uncalled for, especially in our, as I've said before, our post-spotlight view of Roman Catholicism. So the renaming from Pope to Hierophant was not a shift from exoteric to esoteric interpretations of the Arcanum, or an escape from doctrine into mysticism. It was simply the fact that tarot decks were changed by makers who weren't Roman Catholic papists, as Catholics are sometimes called, in complimentary and pejorative ways. And there you have it. So anytime you hear the title Pope and are starting to think of it as representing this dogmatic spirituality or tyranny over the spiritual life of people, that's not what the card was meant, which is why we've fortunately now changed it usually to the Hierophant, because what it was always meant to represent in the tarot deck was the magician, was the adept, was the enlightened spiritual seeker, which is what the Pope represented as a symbol to all of Catholicism, right? St. Francis of Assisi, most of us would argue, well, even the Pope at that time saw St. Francis as his spiritual superior and kissed him on the feet, depending on which versions of history you believe. So, but yet St. Francis of Assisi still sought the Pope out as the spiritual leader that he respected, because that was the power of the symbol, right? So I'm arguing for the Pope being interpreted as a powerful symbol of spiritual leadership, the same way the Hierophant would be interpreted today. In that sense, the Pope is also the symbol representative of the magician or the adept, in a way, remarkably, that even the magician card isn't. It's almost like the magician card is more of a representative of the action of the adept or the magus, and the Hierophant is the magus himself. The Hierophant is the full Ouroboros of the cycle from new life to mastery to death and rebirth, right? From neophyte to Hierophant. This is all about benediction, though benediction is not the key spiritual exercise of this Arcanum for Tomberg. It's a very crucial role. He says, now benediction is more than just a simple good wish made for others. It is also more than a magical impress of personal thought and will upon others. It is the putting into action of divine power transcending the individual thought and will of the one who is blessed, as well as the one who is pronouncing the blessing. In other words, it is an essentially sacerdotal act. Now, the Kabbalah compares the role of prayer and benediction to a double movement, ascending and descending, similar to the circulation of the blood. The prayers of humanity rise towards God, and after having been divinely oxidized, is how Tomberg describes it, they are transformed into benedictions which descend below from above. Now, Tomberg's invocation of Kabbalah here to describe the double movement of prayer, the below to above and the above to below of the Emerald Tablet, which of course we know now comes to us from Arabic alchemy and not any kind of Hermetic writings whatsoever, highlights the need for both active prayer and the passive reception of blessing or benediction. So in a recent interview, leading scholar of Kabbalah, Moshe Adel, highlighted the contrast between Jewish and Christian mysticism in a very interesting way. He said Jewish mysticism is defined by its activity, whereas Bernard McGinn, the leading scholar of Christian mysticism, of course, as we all know, contends Christian mysticism to be exclusively receptive. Exclusively receptive. So they would have these conversations, apparently, according to Professor Adel. And I found that very telling, especially when you think of maybe the reasons why Christians turned to creating a Christian form of Kabbalah. This, of course, explains why Christian Kabbalah became so important to Christian mystics. Since the blessed Raman Lull, or Raman Lully, his name is written various ways throughout books, as you'll notice, in the Middle Ages, through the Italian Renaissance, had a more active or holistic approach and became popular amongst mystics as Christians in Europe began to read about Arabic alchemy and learned Kabbalah, with easy access to that provided by the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, who then circulated throughout Europe. Raman Lull was from Majorca. I don't know if he died there, but Tomberg died in Majorca. So there's an interesting little connection there between the blessed Raman Lull as the first Christian Kabbalist. You could argue, though he never used the word Kabbalah, but Adel has pointed out that he did learn from a Kabbalist, a famous one, in fact. And so that is how the blessed Raman Lull, who also promoted that everyone should learn different languages and peasants should be allowed to read and write and speak other languages. He was a big promoter of early education, you might say, in the same sort of vein that Charlemagne was. And he's called the blessed Raman Lull because he didn't quite make it to canonization. So while Bernard McGinn would likely argue this grafted alien religious praxis onto Christian mysticism with the addition of Kabbalah and Arabic alchemy, others argue this was a return to what was lost from earlier Christian life, of course. Now, what strikes me as a practitioner of both theurgy and thaumaturgy is the blood, infused with prayer, transformed by magic, traveling up to the above of our brain from our body, bringing with it change and affecting it in the brain, which then sends the blood back down below to our body, returning benediction for benediction, transforming prayer to grace. The love we give to God transforms us to love for all that exists. I can't think of a more mystical or magical interpretation of blood, even suggestive of a potential biochemical role it may play in the manifestation of light in our lives. Which brings us to the spiritual exercise of the fifth arcanum, respiration, spiritual respiration in this case, but of course, that is the above of the physical respiration of the body. So let us also allow ourselves to consider above and below to not necessarily be points in space, but rather the above may refer to existence in time, past, present, future, altogether united as the fourth dimension of space, time, reality. We all know the cube image and how that fits. And that would be the way I would recommend considering that framework. It's an interesting model to contemplate, the cube of space in relationship to the above and below and the circulation of the blood. So the next part of the card that we're going to look at that is essential to understanding how this benediction happens, because you can already see how interrelated benediction is to what Tomberg would consider magical practice, or even the inner alchemy of self-transformation. He doesn't use these words as often as we do, for example, but they're evidently still there. And of course, that's a big part of his project of bringing this stuff into the Catholic community. This is why one of the acolytes of the card has his left hand raised and his right hand lowered. The two blue columns behind the Pope symbolize, in the first place, this twofold current rising and descending of prayers and benedictions. In occultism, this gesture that you see the two people making in the Marseille deck, you don't have it in the Rider-Waite deck. You don't have these gestures. You have the two little monks here, or acolytes, as he calls them, with their hand, one down and one up. And this, of course, is considered by Tomberg as suggestive of the as above, so below, the famous goat of Mendes, the Salviat Coagula. In occultism, this gesture, two above and below, was made famous by Eliphas Lévy's Goat of Mendes. His image from 1856 is a publication of Rituel and Dogma of High Magic in the French original, and alleged to be a key symbol of the Catholic monastic order of the Knights Templar. The up and downward hands of the goat labeled with Salve and Coagula, respectively. This is the idea that we dissolve upward till change occurs, which then solidifies or manifests below as something transformed or made anew. And anyone who's done those experiments in chemistry class knows exactly what we're talking about. It's the same process you see in the distillation of alcohol or other tinctures from plant matter or old soup or potatoes, depending on how Irish you are, I suspect. The close parallels of alchemical practice and prayer and magic being really well established by this point amongst esoteric thinkers, we can take a quick detour from our chapter to maybe just look at how prevalent and ancient these ideas of this circulation are through the symbol of the Ouroboros, represented in alchemy, but dating back as far as ancient Egypt, as we can see here, either in a figure eight or as a circle. In each, the snake or serpent or dragon always bites its own tail. I mean, sometimes it doesn't quite, and it looks like it's trying, but you know, the idea is that it's meant to always bite its tail, and may it always bite its tail, as they say. We find the Ouroboros in ancient Egypt, but whether you interpret it as a symbol of Osiris reborn as Ra, or whether you see it as a symbol of eternity, like the Gnostics did in the Pistis Sophia texts, where they saw it as the soul of the world and the cyclical progress across the zodiac. And we also find the imagery of the serpent of the world or the dragon of nature across other cultures, such as Norse, Celtic, Indian, most of them, I'd say. I'd be very curious which cultures don't have this symbol, in fact. All we can be certain of is that this is a very powerful symbol and does not have a singular interpretation and does not mean the same thing to everybody. And this is, of course, where all those conspiracy theorists sort of go awry, is always trying to suggest that there's like just one meaning to everything and everyone should either agree with it or they're wrong. It just, history doesn't work that way. And so Neither do symbols. And yet this mystical symbol is so pervasive across cultures that it has actually inspired many scientific breakthroughs. The German organic chemist August Kekulé described the eureka moment when he realized the structure of benzene after he saw a vision of the Ouroboros. He said, "I was sitting writing at my textbook, but the work did not progress. My thoughts were elsewhere. I turned my chair to the fire and dozed. Again, the atoms were gambling before my eyes. This time, the smaller groups kept modestly in the background. My mental eye, rendered more acute by the repeated visions of the kind, could now distinguish larger structures of manifold conformation, long rows sometimes more closely fitted together, all twining and twisting in a snake-like motion. But look, what was that? Oh, the snakes had seized hold of its own tail, and the form whirled mockingly before my eyes, as if by a flash of lightning I awoke. And this time I also spent the rest of the night in working out the consequences of this hypothesis." Now, what's interesting to me is that I hadn't heard of this before. Of course, I don't use Wikipedia very much, but it is worth noting that often updates and new tidbits of information are added there much faster than they are published in books or articles. So it can be a good news source somewhat in that regard. But of course, I do agree with the analysis of Michael Scott about Wikipedia, if you recall what he said, that famous beloved fictional character. "Wikipedia is the best thing ever. Anyone in the world can write anything they want about any subject, so you know you're getting the best possible information." Michael Scott, quoted by Frater RC. And yes, this is my first meme in a lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Tomberg says, "At the same time, the Pope himself holds aloft a triple cross on the side with the column of prayer, and the praying acolyte, whilst on his right hand on the side with the column of benediction, and the acolyte receiving or inspiring benediction, makes the gesture of benediction." Now, what are these two blue columns? I think most of you will be able to guess. Clearly, Tomberg was working from a Marseille deck that was colored in and not black and white, as published in Meditations on the Tarot. And the two pillars are blue, yet still representing Jachin and Boaz of the temple in Jerusalem, and what Tomberg calls the two sides of Kabbalah. The two sides of Kabbalah, the right side and the left side, and the two columns of the spherotic tree, the pillar of mercy and that of severity, and similarly the two pillars of the Temple of Solomon, Jachin and Boaz, correspond exactly to the two columns of prayer and benediction on this card, because it is severity which stimulates prayer and it is mercy which blesses. The venous blue blood of Boaz ascends, and the arterial oxidized red blood of Jachin descends. The red blood bears the vivifying benediction of oxygen. The blue blood rids the organism of the severity of carbonic acid. It is the same in spiritual life. Spiritual asphyxia menaces he who does not practice some form of prayer. He who practices it receives vivifying benediction in some form. The two columns, therefore, have an essentially practical significance, as practical spiritually as respiration is for the physical body. And here we see a lovely version of the Vitruvian man, the Vitruvian angelic man with some more serpents twining up in Ouroboros-like fashion or Kundalini-like style. This shows us the part of the exercise of the fifth arcanum, the spiritual respiration. The blue blood pillar, severity, Boaz, the pillar of form, as it's also called, and Tomberg designates it as the pillar of prayer. So here's the pillar of prayer. While the red blood pillar of Jachin, mercy, the pillar of force, represents the benediction or grace from God necessitated by our prayers. And I think that is actually a very elegant way of looking at it. The work we do, what we do is severe. right? We're the ones having to write things down and figure them out and keep track of things and try and develop our spirituality, especially if we're practicing magic, theurgy, thaumaturgy, any of these things. And we're sending up our prayers as best we can. That's why we're practicing things like talismanic images or different forms of sigil work, all in congruence and relationship with the spirits, so that we can structure our prayers upwards and hopefully achieve the result of grace descending. Of course, that grace is necessitated by our prayers, as said. So just as the form we give our prayers transforms into the force and power of grace and blessings manifested in our lives, so the way we form our daily lives impacts the biochemistry of our body and brain through our blood and waters and fluids. And this is something we only know better and better as time goes on and we learn more about how our health works. I think it is worth mentioning that one of the main exercises I practiced and still sometimes use comes from Franz Barden's initiation into Hermetics, properly titled, of course, the Way of the True Adept, Der Weg zum wahren Adepten, where we visualize the electric blue and magnetic currents moving up and down around us almost exactly as they are shown in this diagram. So Bauden has a practice where you visualize the red going up one side of your body and blue light descending down as a way of charging and tuning your sphere to be able to create psychic effects more easily, as well as move consciousness and cause other results that he describes in that book. Tomberg continues to say that there are two forms of this spiritual exercise of respiration. He says there are two kinds of respiration, horizontal and vertical. Horizontal respiration, which takes place between outside and inside, so this is on this horizontal plane, and vertical respiration, which takes place between above and below. The sting of death, he says, or the essential crisis of the supreme agony is the abrupt passage from horizontal to vertical respiration. Yet he who has learnt vertical respiration whilst living will be spared from this sting of death. This is Tomberg's main argument, I suppose, for why would you bother? Some people might say, why would you bother? What's the matter? Why do I need a spiritual relationship? Why do I need to have some relationship to anything divine or greater than myself? Well, his argument would be to avoid the sting of death. And maybe none of you have ever been afraid of dying in your lives. I doubt that's the case, but maybe. But either way, it's still an abrupt transition. So Tomberg says, for him, the passage from the one form of respiration to the other will not be the nature of a right angle, but rather that of an arc or circle. The transition will not be abrupt, but gradual and curved instead of rectangular. And I was interested in this idea to see how it might be when you're faced with that stage of life. So I did talk to my mother, who, of course, is, in her mid-70s and still has cancer, but has beat much cancer, so she's kicking ass and taking names and just living her best life, but also has been facing death for a long time. Also, she has done meditation and transcendental meditation, yoga, astrology, Golden Dawn, magic, her whole life, all of these things. So who better to ask about this alleged incoming right angle versus slow crescent? And I've heard people theorize that this is why when you're older, you sleep so much, because your spirit's getting ready to depart. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thought. So I asked her about this, and she said definitely. Her answer was definitely. She definitely feels that she's not afraid at all. And that seems to be the case, according to her word. And that will be a smooth transition. She's ready for it. She feels like she's already maybe happening. I don't know. But it's definitely this spiritual respiration on a vertical axis that she feels has allowed her, as Tomberg says it will, to approach that transition in a much more full and less stinging way, I suppose, would be Tomberg's nomenclature, the sting of death. Now, the essence, he says, of vertical respiration is the alternation between prayer and benediction, or grace. These two elements of vertical respiration manifest themselves in all domains of the inner life, mind, heart, and will. thus a relevant problem for the mind, which is not due to curiosity or intellectual collectionism, but rather to the thirst for truth, is fundamentally a prayer. And the illumination by which it may be followed is the corresponding benediction or grace. True suffering also is fundamentally always a prayer. And this is very big in Christian thought, of course, and probably in other religious thought as well, though I don't know them as well. And the consolation of peace and joy which can follow are the effects then of that benediction or grace corresponding to the acts of prayer. I would suggest that we consider here the outside and the inside of horizontal respiration analogous to the mystery of the minutum mundum, the little world of our microcosm, the outside being the macrocosm. However, the above and below, not the same as the New Age addition to the maxim, as above, so below, as within, so without. So I would say no to that. The Emerald Tablet firstly begins with as below, so above, not the other way around, essentially, and despite common mistranslations. Secondly, there is no mention of within and without in the sense meant by current pop occultism. And so to conflate the above and the below with the inside and the outside, I think is a reduction to the absurd, a reduction to the point of uselessness for our spiritual purposes. I propose, and this is my edgiest thing I'm going to say throughout this lecture, I propose we consider the above and below rather representative of the mystery of the one and the two. We see the two pillars, blue and red, albeit normally black and white. They're of form and force, prayer and benediction or grace, blessings. Benediction, grace, and blessings are meant as the same thing, and then prayer as separate, right? These represent two-ness, the pillars, but are clearly united at the top, at the bottom, and middle by the human being. Unity, the pillar of consciousness. We stand in the middle here as the pillar of consciousness, the middle pillar that is brought into being by these two opposing forces and their dual opposing charges, and therefore propelled upwards like a snake rising, as we say, on the pathway of nature, winding to and fro. So which in the above state is united as the miracle of one thing? That's language I'm using from the Emerald Tablet, of course. However, below that, we live in division, duality, here on the horizontal plane. So I think, therefore, as above represents unity, so below represents duality. This is the somewhat new insight or idea I'm proposing to be considered. And it is we who unite them, or perhaps are simply best representative of their mystery of that unity. So how one becomes two and two becomes one. In my opinion, this is what Crowley meant by his formula in the Book of Lies as 0 equals 2. It's a very dramatic and edgy text he wrote that we all loved as teenagers, I'm sure. But these are just my thoughts, of course. My insights are perhaps revelation, and I am intentionally challenging my own thinking here, so be warned. True effort of the will, i.e. 100% effort, true work, is also a prayer. When it is intellectual work, it is prayer. Hallowed be thy name. When it is creative effort, it is prayer. Thy kingdom come. When it is work with a view to supplying for the material needs of life, it is prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. And all these forms of prayer in the language of work have their corresponding benedictions and graces. And you hear this all the time amongst mystics or gurus or enlightened people, that everything becomes a prayer. They start living their whole life as a living prayer. And this is a powerful idea that it could be easily discarded as so simple that it's trite, but it's a mysterious idea. And the more you pursue it, the more it will pursue you, perhaps. You are absolutely correct, of course, to think here that Tomberg cannot be suggesting true effort of will without at least considering Crowley. Even though, of course, Tomberg cannot give the self-proclaimed great beast a seat at the table in this anonymous work of esoteric Catholic mysticism, nevertheless, we might surmise even Tomberg anticipated Thelemites reading his text one day and swaying them away from their Crowleyanity back to Christianity. It is difficult to completely avoid interpreting Meditations on the Tarot as a clever opus of proselytization, targeting, at least in part, the occult community in which Tomberg spent his whole entire life. So Tomberg says this formula for vertical respiration is the 9 Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 to 12. And he quotes 2 Corinthians, where St. Paul says, the Lord is spirit, and where the spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Part of the reason Tomberg hits this point so hard is because of his anthroposophical background and Rudolf Steiner's key teaching on this philosophy of spiritual freedom. For Steiner, that was the beginning and end. The most important thing in the entire universe was human beings having complete spiritual freedom. So Tomberg obviously still not only agrees with that, but sees that idea alive within Catholic and Christian theology and spiritual life, more importantly. Here we must keep in mind that even though the epistles of Paul are in Koine Greek, the word for spirit in Hebrew and in any Hebrew's mind is the same as the word for breath, right? Ruach. So spirit is breath and breath is spirit. It's the same issue that you got to keep in mind when if you're reading German writers, and this is a big thing with the German occult literature as a little aside, because they have the same word in German for mind and spirit. So when you're reading German magicians' writings in the grimoire, they're saying Geist, and you have to know by context whether they're talking about their mind or spirit. Very interesting, eh? It's amazing how much just the language we work in and think in actually can even result in completely different schematics of our view of reality and metaphysics. It's very different if spirit and mind are two different things, or if they just have only one word for them. So spirit is breath and breath is spirit. A cultural process in 2 parts, but united through the process of breathing, which oxygenates our blood and gives us life. As we say in the neophyte initiation in the Golden Dawn, actually, breath is the evidence of life, represented by the letter H, the first letter of the 3 main officers, Hegemon, Hieros, and Hierophant. And this is a whole thing in the initiation. And of course, even though we're using the Golden Dawn correspondence to the Hierophant of the letter Vav as the Hebrew letter corresponding to the Hierophant, if you read the Hierophant as the 5th Arcanum, well, the 5th Hebrew letter is He, so it still is the letter that represents what Tomberg says. It's interesting also, I think, in this part where he talks about intellectual work and creative effort. This applies to our creation of magical tools, of sigils, angelic seals, everything. These are all prayers. The making of these things are prayers. Intellectual study, no matter how rigorous it may be, is also a prayer and brings a blessing. This was Maimonides' big point, was that through intellectual and rational labor, we can achieve the angelic mind. And that's why the Zohar was written, was because they were so upset with his arguments about achieving angelic status and enlightenment, essentially through intellectual labor, that they wrote the Zohar, and the Zohar was published as a foil to Maimonidean thought. But now those two are very much united as one thing in most current occultism, which is something that tickles me a bit. Now, the spiritual exercise of respiration must include both vertical and horizontal respiration. So the Hierophant doesn't represent just one of these, but both of them, and more than that, the balance of both of them. That is the actual exercise. It's not just to, aspirate vertically or horizontally. It's to balance those two and bring them into harmony. Tomberg says the 9 Beatitudes from Christ's Sermon on the Mount are what teach us vertical respiration, which consists of 3 stages, he says, and is encapsulated by the exhortation to love thy God with all your heart, all your body, and all your mind and soul, and so forth, with everything you have. And the horizontal respiration, Tomberg says, has 3 levels as opposed to stages, and is encapsulated by the law to love thy neighbor as thyself. This is why the Pope holds aloft the triple cross. The triple cross has 3 cross pieces which divide the vertical line into 3 parts, and it is the cross of the complete and perfect spiritual respiration, horizontal and vertical. It is the cross of triple love of thy neighbor. So the lower neighbor equals nature, the equal neighbor equals man, and the higher neighbor equals beings of the hierarchies. Nature's below man, Man is our equal, spiritual beings are our superiors. That's his schematic. And triple love of God, which is the breath or faith, light or hope, or fire or love. So the three levels of horizontal respiration, then, as pointed out by the three-layered scepter, are love of nature, love of one's neighbor, and love of the beings of spiritual hierarchies. I think this is tremendously insightful for and significant for understanding what would be the ethics of magic in this regard. There are two additions to what many would consider love of thy neighbor to mean: nature and spirits and angels. And notice, of course, that demons or daemons are, or otherwise unclean or chthonic spirits, are omitted any specific mention, but are necessarily meant to be, but I don't think they are necessarily meant to be excluded, I would argue. And that goes back to the things he said in previous chapters, of course. So the three stages of vertical respiration happen as such: first purification, then illumination, and then mystical union. If, as we saw with our study, the fourth arcanum, the Emperor, which symbolizes the right relationship between humanity and God, then the Pope or the Hierophant here, as most, non-Roman Catholics are going to likely prefer calling it the Hierophant, of course, as the fifth arcanum symbolizes God's right relationship toward us. Tomberg argues that whatever happens in the world in history, these archetypes will remain. So that's interesting, and again points to the fact that he's sort of more of a perennialist than a dogmatic Roman Catholic. He is still not presenting any kind of at all of an exclusivist Roman Catholicism, but rather pointing to Catholic symbols that are in line with what Tomberg considers universal ideals to be, fit for his understanding, of course, of the Ecclesia Universalis, or the universal church, which is what the Catholic Church literally means. The two posts, that of Emperor and that of Pope, are two spiritual realities. They are as real as the head and the heart are in the life of the individual. The heart is the center of respiration and blood circulation. The head is the center of the nervous system and is the seat of our thought. Tomberg does clarify this a bit and says, just as no parliament will replace the spiritual reality of the post of emperor, the throne of David cannot be replaced by collectivity. So no ecumenical council will replace the spiritual reality of the post of pope, or the throne of Melchizedek, king of plenitude, as the Bible says. Whether the cannon shot predicted in esoteric circles of the Occident be given or not, Tomberg says, whether the sacerdotal throne remains visible or whether it be installed in the catacombs, it will certainly remain present forever and in the future of the history of humanity, despite what the prophets of its destruction may say. So he really does believe that these transcend human structures. Tomberg's bio and his strong grasp of history and war and the legal system — he did become a lawyer in Germany while he was in exile after the Second World War — contrast to his anthroposophy and his this idea of the new Maitreya Buddha coming at the end of the Kali Yuga. So note that this is why there is so much Hindu and yogic content, as well as extensive other Eastern mystical theology in Meditations on the Tarot. It's because this leads very much into Tomberg's view of history. Because history, as moreover the life of the individual, is worked by day and by night. He says it has a diurnal aspect and a nocturnal aspect. The former is exoteric, whilst the latter is esoteric. He says the silence and obscurity of the night is always full of events in preparation, and all that which is unconscious or superconscious in the human being belongs to the domain of the night. This is the magical side of history, the side of magical deeds and works acting behind the facade of history by day. And this is one of my favorite parts of his teachings and Meditations on the Tarot, the way he goes through it throughout the book and talks about the disciples of the night and the disciples of the day, and how Jesus taught one thing to people in public during the day and another thing to his disciples in the garden on the road at night. This idea that these two things are not opposing forces but are harmonious forces and serve different roles in the history and life of humanity. So Tomberg adds an interesting interpretation that gives some insight into that kind of thinking that defined the final stage of his life in the 60s till his death in Majorca in 1972. Again, the homeland of the Blessed Raymond Lull. It's beautiful how these things sort of come full circle. He says, thus, when the gospel was preached by the light of the day in the countries around the Mediterranean, the nocturnal rays of the gospel affected the profound transformation of Buddhism. There, the ideal of individual liberation by entering the state of nirvana gave way to the ideal of renouncing nirvana for the work of mercy towards suffering humanity. The ideal of Mahayana, the great chariot, then had its resplendent ascent to the heaven of Asia's moral values. See what I mean? He has a very occult view of history. And this is something that he never let go after his time with the Anthroposophical Society and studying Rudolf Steiner's thoughts. This is very much Steiner's way of thinking and his way of receiving clairvoyant visions, in fact. So Tomberg still is engaging with that form of interpretation at this stage in his life. Now, a verse from Psalms that he uses to emphasize this beautiful idea of esoteric and exoteric night and day teachings. Dies die eructat verbum et nox nocti indicatientium. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. In the book itself, the word da'at is misspelled resh tzadi tav. In Meditations of the Tarot. In case you are reading it and still learning Hebrew letters, there are not many Hebrew errors in Meditations on the Tarot, but there are some, as is sadly usual in esoteric books these days. So Amer and Da'at, two Hebrew words, which in this psalm Tomberg uses to highlight his point beautifully, in my opinion, that this is the formula of the twofold teaching by the speech of day and by the knowledge of night, of the twofold tradition, by verbal teaching and by direct inspiration, of twofold magic, by the spoken word and by silent radiation, and lastly, of twofold history, visible history by day and invisible history by night. And I think that's a thought these days that it would be hard not to have that resonate within you, given sort of how the world's gone the last 5 years, 10 years. It's I think the idea of parallel histories and secret histories is something that the average person can get behind a bit more. We have always all known that history isn't, like, history's not real. Like, it's always written by victors, right? So it's always so fragmentary and inaccurate. But at the same time, it's worth studying because we do find many lessons in it, and it's fun, right? It's fun. I like it. Now, the posts of the emperor and pope, he says, are two realities beyond as well as on this side of the threshold, which separates day and night. So this idea of day and night is really extended into the idea of spiritual respiration here in a very interesting way. And the pope of the fifth card is the guardian of this threshold. So both of them exist on either side. He is seated between the two pillars, the pillar of day or prayer and the pillar of night or benediction. So it's almost like, we pray to God and seek for guidance in the day, and God returns it in the evening at night, which of course speaks highly of the tradition of dreams and dream communication that we have in Western, I think in all spiritualities. I'd be surprised if there was one that was like, oh no, dreams, nah, bleh. The emperor of the fourth card is the master of the day and the guardian of the blood or quintessence of the nocturnal reality of the day. The pope is the guardian of respiration or of reality of the relationship between day and night. That which he guards is the equilibrium between day and night, between human effort and divine grace. So Tomberg ties this into the separation and naming of darkness and light in Genesis 1. And he says the Ruach Elohim, right? And again, this is Ruach Elohim. So breath or spirit of God, both, he equates psychologically to nirvana. Tomberg says, but the divine breath, Ruach Elohim, is above the ocean of peace of nirvana. The divine breath moves it, and to renounce nirvana after having arrived at its threshold means to say, rise above nirvana and participate in the divine breath transcending it. He's certainly not shy to explore and utilize Eastern thought in his exploration of Catholic mysticism, of course, and magic. But let us return to the post of the Pope, which is the subject of the fifth arcanum of the tarot. It relates to spiritual respiration, as we have said. This is why the Pope represents another category of truth and another criterion of truth than the scientific truth and criterion. This is not your average truth. For him, true is that which comprises harmonious respiration. False is that which upsets the harmony of spiritual respiration. Thus, the heliocentric system of modern astronomical science is true from the point of view of the science of phenomena, but it is at the same time fundamentally false. Here's another example, this time from the domain of esoteric experience. Tomberg says, as we have already mentioned, reincarnation, successive lives of the same human individuality, is a fact of experience, as are the successive periods of wakefulness belonging to the day, which are interrupted by sleep at night. Buddha recognized the fact of reincarnation as such, but he considered it regrettable. This is why the aim of the Eightfold Path, which he taught, is to put an end to reincarnation, because nirvana is the end of successive terrestrial lives. And so the Buddha recognized at the same time, and at the same time denied the fact of reincarnation. He recognized it is fact, and he denied it as ideal, because facts are transitory, they come and go. There was a time when there was no reincarnation, and there will be a time when it will no longer be. Reincarnation commenced only after the fall, according to Tomberg, and it will cease with reintegration. It is therefore not eternal, and it is therefore not an ideal. The fourth arcanum of the Emperor Tomberg describes as having 4 wounds, but the Pope or Hierophant has a 5th wound. Kabbalistically, as resultant operation between the 5th Sephira Geburah and the 4th Sephira Hesed, mercy. So between mercy and power, Geburah and Hesed, the 5th wound, called the wound of the heart, is called the wound of the heart. The 5th wound is called the wound of the heart, and of course is the harmonious sphere of Tiferet, beauty in the center of the tree of life, balancing the severe and merciful pillars, balancing also Keter and Da'at above, and Yesod, foundation, and Malkut below. To understand the significance of this 5th wound, and viewing the Tiferet as this 5th wound of the heart, and what it means to be the Hierophant, Tomberg quotes several prominent occultists and their thoughts on the symbol of humanity, which is, of course, the pentagram. Now, after his analysis of, he quotes Claude Saint-Martin, Josephin Paladin, L.F.L. Lévy, a diverse cultural collection of occultists from France. But after his analysis of their interpretations, Tomberg considers the symbolic movement from the 4 to the 5 in terms of sacred magic. And he agrees and disagrees with some of them variously. He goes through it in detail, which you can read for yourself. But Tomberg comes out on the side that it is a matter of the problem of personal arbitrary magic, the quaternary separated from the decad, and personal sacred magic, the quaternary united and bound to the decad. And this is the thesis, he says, that I put forward with regard to this problem, a thesis which is the fruit of 43 years of experience in the esoteric domain. It is only the pentagram of the 5 wounds which is the effective sign of personal sacred magic, whilst the pentagram of the 5 currents of personal will, no matter how the points of this pentagram are turned, is the effective sign for the imposition of the personal will of the operator on beings weaker than him. It is always a fundamentally tyrannical act. And that would be as close as he comes to really giving, I think, a definition of black magic at this stage. So this is the thesis. Let us now proceed to its explanation. A magical act presupposes an effect surpassing the normal power of the operator. This surplus of power may be furnished by forces which are obedient to the operator, or by forces borrowed by him, or lastly, by forces acting through the operator and which he obeys. So he says then, in the case of forces which are supplied to the operator by submission, it is a matter of the operation of magic that we have designated in letter 3 of the Empress as personal or arbitrary magic. And in other words, an operation whose source of initiative, whose means and aim are found exclusively in the will and understanding of the personality of the operator. It just comes from you and from nothing else whatsoever. Such an operation can only make use of forces lower than the operator, because you have to be able to compel them, right? And so again, we could analyze his understanding of magical theory here, given that his access to magical theory, everyone prior to our current time, they just had much less access. So we have such a wider range of knowledge about this stuff now. Some of his views are perhaps slightly dated, and he would maybe revise some of them with some of the ideas out there today. But we also still see a really valuable analysis of what abusive magic looks like, what abuse of power, what disharmonious or unbalanced force looks like, and how that plays out. And so I think it's still valuable to see his insights when it comes to this, in terms of practice. Such an operation can only make use of forces lower than the operator, for one does not command angels. The operator here is alone and acts as a magical technician under his own responsibility and at his own risk and peril. One could also designate this type of magic as Faustian. So there's 3 types he considers. There's and he uses the Latin phrases: fiat voluntas mea, may my will be done; fiat voluntas nostra, our will be done; and fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done. This is the famous line from, of course, the Lord's Prayer. So he looks at them in terms of Faustian magic, making a deal with the devil, which I think is a very it's a fun term, a fun way to describe what most people would just call sorcery or goetia these days. But again, like how we understand now today that Hermeticism isn't Hermetic philosophy, it's more Hermetic spirituality. He didn't know that back then. That information hadn't come along. And just so, he never got to read Jake Surratt-Kent or some of the other magicians who have reconsidered the history of magic through what we know today, through our improved understanding of things. But that doesn't mean that all of his analyses should be thrown out. Certainly not. I think he has some very powerful ones, especially if you're looking to elevate your form of magic into a more mystical kind that is theurgic in essence, and is perhaps aiming at uniting you with the divine or bringing you comfortably to the hereafter, as opposed to just getting what you want now in this life. So he says of these, the first 2 forms of magic, Faustian and collective, make use of the method of which the pentagram of the 5 currents of personal and collective will is the sign. They are based on the principle that the strong dominates the weak. It is the matter here of the power of compulsion. With respect to the 3rd form of magic, sacred magic, the method it makes use of is not the force of the will, but rather its purity. But as the will as such is never entirely pure, for it is not the flesh which bears the stigmata of original sin, nor thought as such, but rather the will, it is necessary that the 5 dark currents inherent in the human will, i.e. the desire to be great, to take, to keep, to advance, and to hold on to at the expense of others, are paralyzed or nailed. The 5 wounds are therefore the 5 vacuities, which result in the 5 currents of the will. And these vacuities are filled by will from above, i.e. by absolutely pure will. Basically, us getting out of our own way so that our true higher and divine self or will can emanate forth. This is the principle of magic of the pentagram of the 5 wounds. Now, Tomberg is not always strict nor consistent with his definitions, and often slightly redefines words in some cases. For example, with his distinction in letter 3, the Empress, where he distinguishes what he calls sacred magic from theurgy and goetia, etc. But here he returns to equating sacred magic, fiat voluntas tua, with historical theurgy. However, on the way to this really only slight issue, we can see the value in his insights and what they bring, despite some definitional awkwardness and very slight inconsistencies, really. So Lastly, Tomberg says, in the case of forces acting through the operator as intermediary, and which he obeys, it is also a matter of a chain, but a vertical and qualitative hierarchical chain instead of a horizontal and quantitative chain, which latter is the case with collective magic. The operator here is alone in the horizontal sense, but he is not in the vertical sense. Above him, beings higher than him act with him and through him. This type of magic presupposes the fact of being in conscious relationship with higher spiritual beings, i.e., it assumes prior mystical and Gnostic experience. We have designated this type of magic in letter 3 as sacred magic, because the forces active in operations of this magic are superior to the operator. So, however, it's, as always, Tomberg touches on so many diverse ideas in his study that each of them cannot really be explored in full in a single lecture. So I highly encourage you to read it and enjoy his exploration of the pentagram, especially as he discovers many insights by comparison to yoga and Eastern thought. His thoughts on spiritual wounds being the initial development of extrasensory perception, but also their growth into the spiritual organs we may utilize after death, is also very fascinating. So let us conclude our focus on the technique of this fifth arcanum, the Hierophant, the spiritual respiration, and in particular, how it can guide us to better balance and harmony in both of our practice of magic and our spiritual journey. Purity of will over force of will. So with respect to this third form of magic, as he says, sacred magic, the method it makes use of is not the force of will, but rather its purity. And it's so powerful, this advice, if you apply it to your techniques and to your practices. It is just the thing that will make your whole practice come to life. And so, ironically, a lot of the secret to magic is surrendering rather than exerting. So before we find out how Tomberg directs us to acquire these 5 wounds, what Tomberg says about the pentagram itself should be considered. He says, in any case, the pentagram, other than that of the 5 wounds, is not the sign of black magic, but rather that of arbitrary magic, or gray magic, if you wish, because it is the sign of the power of the personality as such, which is inevitably a mixture of good and evil, even when it acts with the best intentions in the world. And more, he says, regarding the 2 forms of the pentagram, with the point above and the point below, they do not in any way correspond to the division of magic into white and black magic, although the traditional masters like Eliphas Levi, for example, do teach that. You can certainly draw the head of the goat, Tomberg says, as Eliphas Levi does, in the reversed pentagram. It does not become, through this, the sign of black magic. How surprised are you to hear Tomberg say that you can draw an inverted pentagram with the head of the goat in it, and it's not necessarily black magic? I'm guessing 1 or 2 of you is slightly surprised to hear Tomberg say that. I know I am. The 2 forms of the pentagram refer to, he says, human electricity. Of course, as every electrician will tell you, I'm sure, i.e. the electricity of the human organism accompanying the movements of the will, of the head and of the legs, which has nothing to do with horns. It is the same electricity in both cases, with the sole difference that in the case of the pentagram, with the point turned above it, is the will of the intellect which moves the electrical currents, whilst in the case of the pentagram with the point turned below, it is the intelligence of the will which does so. The 2 poles of the will can equally serve good or evil, although in fact both represent a mixture of the 2 principles. There exists only one single method, one sole means leading to this, and no matter whether in full knowledge or whether instinctively, every esotericist, every mystic, every idealist, every spiritual seeker, and lastly, every man of goodwill makes use of it in Europe as in Asia, today as 20 centuries ago. This universal method of all ages and cultures is nothing other than the practice of the 3 traditional vows, namely obedience, poverty, and chastity. After elucidating an esoteric understanding of this famous trinity of virtues, which are spiritual practices or even pacts, if you like, then at the end, Tomberg clarifies why they are essential beyond merely personal spiritual questing of each individual. He says, for these three practical vows constitute the preliminary condition for living faith, luminous hope, and ardent love. In other words, for the spiritual respiration of all of humanity. So he's turned these necessary three attributes for personal development and tied them into the necessity for saving all of humanity, for the health of all of humanity. And that is, to me, what I think really defines the understanding of sacred magic, in that there is a sense that this is not a solo journey. You're not on a solo path. You're a part of of many beings, not just the spiritual hierarchy above you and below you and on your plane that help you out, but all of humanity and all of nature. Everything that exists is on a journey together. And that is, I think, the value of his view of sacred magic as something slightly distinct from historical theurgy, and why these three qualities benefit all of humanity and not just the self. He says mankind would suffocate spiritually without faith, hope, and love and charity. And it would be bereft of these if the spiritual practice of obedience, poverty, and chastity, free and holy, were to cease. Tomberg supplies a slightly outdated but still valuable analysis of how he has seen this play out in the 20th century thought, culture, and politics. I would recommend, of course, a book on this by the Franciscan father, Richard Rohr, who was one of my teachers. He's a very popular American Franciscan priest and writer. And his book with that title, Obedience, Poverty, and Chastity, tries to make those ideas more available to the average layperson or non-priest, or just more accessible as spiritual ideals rather than strict observances of a rigorous monastic routine, since none of us, I think, are living in monasteries. I will in the future prepare, of course, an entire lecture on those three virtues if you would like, and I think it would be very insightful, especially to take into consideration their more occult qualities. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and that is all, folks. I will quickly check and see if there's any questions that I can answer while the recording is still live.